Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Benjamin Netanyahu is not defending Israel. He is gambling with its future and with Lebanon's survival to save his own political skin. What he calls a security strategy is, in truth, a rolling catastrophe written in rubble, displacement, and corpses stretching from the border villages of southern Lebanon to the outskirts of Beirut. For years, Netanyahu has peddled the same corrosive myth to the Israeli public, that every crisis can be bombed away, that decisive force can substitute for strategy, and that overwhelming power can conjure peace through destruction. That myth has sustained his political brand for decades, but now he is exporting it again to Lebanon. In the wake of the Gaza war, his government has steadily expanded operations along the northern front, authorizing deeper incursions and establishing what it calls new positions in Lebanese territory in the name of deterrence and security. In reality, these moves have seeded a slow-motion regional fire from which neither Lebanon nor the wider Middle East may ever fully recover. Netanyahu's own words betrayed the mindset. He has vowed publicly that Lebanon could see the same destruction and suffering as Gaza if Hezbollah refuses to yield. His allies in government speak with unnerving casualness about finishing the job, language that reduces an entire sovereign nation to an unfinished demolition project, an object lesson to be completed with fire and steel. When reports surfaced that Netanyahu might entertain a ceasefire framework or a limited de-escalation on the northern front, his office moved swiftly to quash them, boasting that he had instructed the military to continue striking Lebanon with full force. Full force. Those words now carry a familiar meaning. They translate into leveled housing blocks, convoys of displaced families, and ordinary Lebanese civilians digging their children's bodies out of concrete dust. Israeli operations since 2024 have included not just air campaigns, but ground incursions, repeated waves of bombing and strafing that have killed thousands, many of them civilians, and destroyed what little infrastructure the Lebanese state still possessed after years of financial collapse and political paralysis. During 1 week in late September 2024 alone, Israeli airstrikes killed more than 800 people in Lebanon, part of a wider assault that Lebanon's government says has taken thousands of lives. By early 2026, the Israeli army was touting hundreds of militia infrastructures destroyed and hundreds of fighters killed, while the countryside of southern Lebanon turned into a militarized wasteland where civilians were told to flee but had nowhere safe to go. Netanyahu's defenders, both inside Israel and among his global supporters, insist this escalation is forced upon him by Hezbollah's rocket fire and Iran's patronage of militant proxies. Hezbollah's weapons and Tehran's ambitions are indeed dangerous. Yet the measure of leadership is not whether threats exist, but how one responds to them. Whether you choose a strategy that makes your people safer, or one that traps them in perpetual conflict. Inside Israel, many veteran security officials and analysts have warned that a full-scale war in Lebanon would be a strategic disaster. Tens of thousands dead, enormous damage on both sides, and no plausible endgame. Intelligence professors have urged political restraint precisely because Lebanon cannot be subdued without igniting an even wider conflict. Netanyahu has dismissed these warnings as weakness, pressing ahead with the confidence of a man for whom escalation has always been the default language of power. The deeper truth, difficult but unavoidable, is that Netanyahu's decisions are not primarily about national security. They are about his own survival. By 2024 and 2025, he was besieged politically at home, by his corruption trial, by the deep unpopularity of his far-right coalition partners, by massive street protests over his attempts to neuter Israel's judiciary, and by international criticism of his Gaza campaign. Each crisis should have humbled him. Instead, he turned them into fuel. The longer the region remained in turmoil, the more he could present himself as the indispensable wartime leader, the only figure capable of guiding Israel through existential peril. In this light, Lebanon's agony becomes less a tragic side effect than a calculated backdrop. Keeping Israel in a state of emergency delays accountability, postpones elections, and keeps courts and political rivals off balance. It turns warfare into governance and crisis into a strategy. This pattern has not gone unnoticed in Washington. The Biden administration, bruised by the protracted conflict in Gaza, pressed Netanyahu's government for de-escalation of the northern border, warning that another war could shatter what remains of regional stability. Diplomatic efforts through Paris and Amman sought to create a framework that might restore quiet along the blue line. Netanyahu met those overtures with defiance. He publicly accused the United States of withholding arms, complained about supposed pressure to limit Israel's freedom of action, and treated any sign of Allied discomfort as betrayal. He was perfectly willing to alienate Israel's closest allies, not out of conviction that a strategy would work, but to prevent any diplomatic leash from tempering the military machine he controls. The cost has been steep. Diminished American trust, open frustration in European capitals, and a growing sense that Israel's leadership has abandoned prudence for political theater. While Netanyahu plays out a survival drama, Lebanon teeters on the edge of collapse. Years of economic freefall, currency implosion, and mass emigration have gutted the state. The Beirut port explosion in 2020 destroyed more than an urban district. It destroyed a nation's last remaining illusion of functioning governance. Into that exhaustion, Netanyahu has poured destruction. Air raids on densely populated towns, bombardment of roads and power stations, and cross-border incursions that blur the line between limited strikes and invasion. Israeli officials boast about hitting thousands of targets. They also warn ominously that they have not yet displayed their full capabilities, a phrase that hovers like a threat over a country already broken. Each new round of violence shreds another layer of Lebanon's fragile recovery. What remains is displacement, despair, and the ever-present fear that the Gaza nightmare will be repeated in the north. Lebanon, already a patchwork of confessions and factions, now risks devolving entirely into chaos. Netanyahu's cynical bet is that he can perpetuate this destruction while shifting blame onto Hezbollah. Every demolished apartment building is declared a hidden weapon cache. Every civilian casualty reclassified as collateral damage of a terrorist organization's cynicism. The narrative portrays Israel as reactive, forced into violence by an enemy that hides among innocents. But the pattern of decision-making tells another story, one of deliberate escalation, of political choice masquerading as necessity. His cabinet has repeatedly opted to expand operations rather than seek diplomatic exits, to deepen incursions rather than test restraint, to treat a neighboring state as a military problem to be managed rather than a political crisis to be solved. Security experts inside Israel have warned that such moves risk igniting an uncontrollable regional war. Netanyahu's response has been the same as always: more force, more rhetoric, more defiance. This is not reluctant self-defense. It is ambition armed with jet fighters. And here lies the paradox that would worry any strategist who still believes in rational statecraft. The more Netanyahu destroys, the stronger Hezbollah's story becomes. Each bomb dropped on a Lebanese neighborhood reinforces the malicious central claim that only armed resistance can defend Lebanon from annihilation. Every funeral procession throughout the rubble becomes a recruiting speech Hezbollah never has to give. Every child whose home is gone becomes proof, in their eyes, that Israel understands only the language of violence. In strategic terms, Netanyahu is writing Hezbollah's next chapter for them, undermining the very security he claims to defend. What he calls deterrence is, in practice, the cultivation of endless hostility. It is not strategy, it is dependency on perpetual crisis. A responsible Israeli leadership would move in the opposite direction. It would recognize that security cannot be purchased through firepower alone, that the northern border needs not another operation but a durable settlement security guarantees, mediated negotiations, and acknowledgement of Lebanon's sovereignty. But Netanyahu's government has substituted politics with performance. He speaks constantly of finishing the job, a phrase that now translates to open-ended military campaigns with no political horizon. To finish the job would mean to finish Lebanon itself, to reduce a neighboring society to fragments that can no longer threaten, but also can no longer live. It is a vision of dominance born of fear, not of strategy. The tragedy is that this dynamic corrodes Israel from within as well. Perpetual war demands perpetual militarization. Institutions grow deferential to the security establishment. Dissent becomes suspect. Media narratives narrow around wartime unity. Each campaign abroad legitimizes greater repression at home. Ordinary Israelis pay a price, too, in sleepless nights as rockets fall from the north, in sons deployed in yet another indefinite campaign, and the slow normalization of a state of siege as national identity. In this sense, Netanyahu's Lebanon policy is not just a threat to regional peace. It is a slow poison to Israeli democracy itself. Every bomb that falls across the border reverberates through Israel's own political institutions, hardening them, making citizens accustomed to crisis, and cynical about alternatives. Regionally, the consequences ripple outward. Iran watches and calibrates. The Gulf states who attentively normalized relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords now distance themselves again, unwilling to tie their fortunes to perpetual war. Western powers fret about oil prices and refugee flows. The entire Middle East becomes an ecosystem of fear, shaped by one man's determination to stay in power. By the week of March 9th, the humanitarian toll in Lebanon had reached staggering levels. 800,000 displaced, entire districts without electricity, foreign aid convoys struggling to enter through collapsed road networks. The descriptions from journalists read like dispatches from a disaster zone. Roads cratered, villages abandoned, fields blackened. And still the campaign continues. The moral case against Netanyahu's course is clear enough, but the strategic one is equally damning. Destroying Lebanon does not eliminate Hezbollah. It entrenches it. Weakening Lebanon's state does not secure Israel. It ensures chaos on its northern frontier for years to come. Even from a cold-eyed realist perspective, this is self-defeating behavior. Yet Netanyahu acts as if his political future depends on keeping the region perpetually aflame, and perhaps it does. Each ceasefire would invite questions about his corruption trial, about the judicial overhaul, about the failures of domestic governance. Each pause would remind Israelis that their leader has no post-war vision. Escalation, by contrast, is a narrative he knows how to manage. It allows him to stand before cameras, speak of existential threats, and wrap his survival in the flag. Lebanon, meanwhile, bears the unbearable cost. It is not an abstract adversary or a chessboard, but a real country with families, schools, and futures now disintegrating under bombardment. Its people have endured enough. Decades of civil war, sectarian corruption, endless power games played by stronger neighbors. To subject them once again to destruction motivated by another leader's political vanity is an act of staggering cruelty. And yet much of the international community continues to treat the conflict as a border flare-up, issuing the usual calls for restraint before turning back to other crises. That reflexive indifference enables the cycle. As long as the world accepts Netanyahu's framing of total war as self-defense, the devastation will continue. At some point, accountability must return to the conversation. If justice is to mean anything in international law or diplomacy, it cannot apply only to the defeated. Netanyahu's record in Lebanon should be remembered, documented, and judged for what it is: a conscious policy of escalation that sacrificed civilian lives for domestic political gain. The destruction of Lebanon's infrastructure, the death of thousands of innocents, the deliberate sabotage of diplomatic initiatives, all of it reflects decisions, not accidents, and the consequences will outlast him. When the bombs stop falling, Lebanon will still be struggling to rebuild, its social fabric shredded, its economy in ruins. Israel will still face a hardened Hezbollah, a global reputation in tatters, and a generation of citizens trained to equate leadership with belligerence. History offers little comfort to leaders who mistake survival for destiny. Netanyahu's gamble is not merely reckless, it is delusional. It assumes that a society can build security out of fear, that legitimacy can be reconstructed from rubble, that perpetual conflict can substitute for vision. The power pursued this way always consumes itself. Every strike he orders deepens the isolation of Israel abroad and the cynicism of his politics at home. Every displaced Lebanese refugee, every family mourning its dead, becomes another testament to the futility of the path he has chosen. What he leaves behind will not be a stronger Israel or a pacified border, but a warning carved into the landscape of the Levant, that leadership untethered from accountability eventually destroys everything it claims to protect. Nations survive their leaders, but the generations growing up amid this devastation will inherit the bitterness that Netanyahu has nurtured for his own convenience. They will remember not the slogans about deterrence, but the endless funerals, the fear, and the sense that war has no conclusion because it has become a habit of governance. And someday, when Israelis and Lebanese alike ask how their security came to mean permanent insecurity, the record will point back to this moment, to a leader who saw the brink of catastrophe, recognized its political utility, and stepped forward anyway. If there remains any justice in the world's conscience, it will not be Lebanese civilians who pay for these decisions alone. The responsibility belongs to the man who turned war into a campaign platform and crisis into a governing principle. Netanyahu's legacy in Lebanon is not one of protection or defense. It is a portrait of what happens when political desperation masquerades as national purpose. It is a legacy of rubble, of lives cut short, and of a region set ablaze to preserve one man's place in power. This has been America's Fractured Politics. Thank you for listening. Until next time.